So this is session 3, and we're going to be talking about some of the latest technology and our conservation programs. Our first speaker will be Professor Barry Brook and from the University of Tasmania, and he'll be opening and talking about his customizable AI system, which is classifying species from camera traps. And for us at TLC, this has been really critical, and his help and support both within the Wild Tracker program, but also within our science program. So I'd like to welcome Barry to the stage.
Thanks, Kath. So as Kath said, the AI system I'm going to briefly talk about today has been integrated within Wild Tracker, which Glenn will talk about next. So I won't spend any time on that integration. Instead, I'll just give you a brief overview of what the system actually is. It's called MUC, and it stands for Mega Efficient Wildlife Classifier. But I wasn't just being funny there. There's two components to it. One of them is called Mega Detector, which finds animals and images, and the other one's called Efficient Net, which classifies them, so the mega and efficient. But it is megally efficient. So there is, if you're interested to know more about it, there is a paper that's free, available online in the Peer Community Journal, which describes it in detail. You just got to search for Mega Efficient Wildlife Classifier. But in brief, MUC, which I'll call it from now on, is a multi-stage process. It first takes raw camera trap images, and the reason we want to do this with artificial intelligence is because there's a huge volume of these that gets collected, and if you haven't got a lot of expert time to go through them and classify them, then they're pretty images, but they're not actually scientific data. So we want to accelerate the time frame from collecting images through to being able to make ecological inferences from them. And this is where a system like MUC can really help out. But in order to do that, it has to first find animals and images, and that's a process known as object detection. And the Mega Detector, which has been trained on millions of images worldwide, is plugged into the system to do that. So we don't even need to build that, and it works very well. Then when the animals are found, they're snipped out of the image and sent to a classifier, which I trained. And that classifier then provides a prediction, which can then be mapped back onto the images and also stored in a database, which can then be used for analysis. So this is an example of a bunch of photographs taken from my camera network, and the red box around it is the result of the Mega Detector finding and locating animal within the image and just taking that out. And a big advantage of doing that is it removes all of the background, and so you're just focused on the animal, which improves greatly the classification. However, not all images are that easy to classify. So we get a range of things, some of which are just difficult because they're up close, or they're a tail, or poorly illuminated, or the Mega Detector has missed them. And there are other things like gumboots, which the classifier doesn't know about. So it has to make a guess at what it is. So for gumboots, it would call that a black currawong, for example, with high confidence, not because it's confident as a black currawong, but because it's confident it's much more like that than anything else in the data set. So there are limitations to AI depending on the quality of our data that's collected. Now, one way to overcome those limitations is to load all the images once they've been processed by AI up into a database like Camelot, which is available as a free download, or ADEX AI, which is a system which you can run on your own computer and run MUC through a graphical user interface on your computer because it's been plugged into ADEX AI as well. But let's say you're working on your local desktop and you're not using a graphical user interface to manage your images. Then a new innovation which I'm working on right now called MUC Table, and I'll explain why it's called MUC Table in a moment, but MUC Table allows you to then go in and look at the AI classifications and fix them up however you want. So you can go into a folder where it's put what it thinks are blank images, and you can pull them out and drag them into species folders. You can change images around in different species folders. There are a number of extra interventions you can do. It's totally voluntary. You can leave a human out of the loop completely and it will still do a good job. But you can improve upon those images to greatly enhance the overall usability of the data set. And another good feature of MUC Table, which is, as I said, currently under development, but I hope will be incorporated into a future version of Wild Tracker, is that it looks at the whole context of the images. So often we have a sequence of animal images, and some of them are very clear what the animal is, and other ones might be bits of tail or a nose or a whisker or something like that. But that context actually holds all of the information required to key out those poor images, because we've seen the good quality image amongst that string. And using some simple decision rules, we can go back and recode a lot of the data set to take account of that. So when we have a final data table like this, which can then be imported into a piece of software for analysis or for mapping, then we can take account of not only the individual images, which is what Muke works on, but the whole collection of images, and work out what are different events, how the images relate to each other, and draw much stronger ecological inferences as a consequence. So now I'll hand over to Glenn, and he can talk more about Wild Tracker. Muke's plugged into Wild Tracker, but it's an early version of Muke. So if you've used it so far, you might be less than impressed with some of its classifications. Well, we've got a new version which we're working to integrate, which has a much higher quality, and as I said, takes account of the context information, which greatly improves its ability to give you a good idea of what you're seeing. Okay, Glenn.
Wait for that to come up. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Barry, for setting the scene for a very quick update on our Wild Tracker program. For those who aren't aware, oh, that's not even playing, is it? Oops. Okay. Wow. There we go. That's much better. For those who aren't aware, Wild Tracker is the TLC's citizen science program where we ask landholders who are using camera traps to upload the photos they collect from their property and also help us classify the species that are in them. So as a very quick overview, currently we have 473 participants or landholders registered to use Wild Tracker. We have 498 properties in the system, and as you can see from the map, they provide a pretty good spread across the state. Together, people have uploaded more than 1,128,000 photos. About a quarter of these have user tags or species tags associated with them. Among the Wild Tracker properties, we also have a pretty good representation of land for wildlife properties, and we have more than 50 conservation covenants included as well. But interestingly, the median property size for Wild Tracker is just 4 hectares, with about a third of properties in that less than 2 hectare range. So that also indicates that we have quite a diverse group of landholders involved. But like any citizen science program, participation in Wild Tracker varies as well. And this framework sort of sums it up for me, where we have everyone from initial droppers, people who register with the best intentions, but then may not go any further, through to nibblers who drop in and out of the program. Maybe they upload a survey each year, which is fantastic and all that I'm really asking for. All the way through to those people who are hooked and are consistently uploading data sets and tagging all of the photos that they upload as well. But we are aware that there are multiple barriers to participating, like in any citizen science program. At the lower levels, it tends to be the technical design of Wild Tracker itself, which we have done a lot of work on improving, things like the stability of photo uploads, through to people's digital literacy. Many of our supporters haven't used websites like this before, and many have never used camera traps. Higher up the chain, some people might lose a little interest when they see the same species popping up on their camera over and over again. And then others might not have that confidence in their identification skills. And so they tend to upload photos but not go through the classification process. So that's where Sticky Beak comes in. So this is our AI infrastructure into which we've plugged in Barry's team's amazing work, and we're very grateful for Barry and his team for making that open source so that we can put it to good use and everyone that we work with can benefit from that. But as Barry mentioned, it isn't the latest version, and we're very excited to hopefully by the end of the year have that new model updated. So this is how it works in the actual website. When we have a photo, you can hover over the box and it will highlight the animal. Hopefully it's an animal. You can click in the box and it will provide a species list, and you can select the animal from that list. Or if it's not an animal, remove the box. If we chose the right species, well, I'm going to say right in this case, it's a black swan. So we get a nice work, we have a match, and the box around the animal turns green. Hovering over the little information icon next to Sticky Beaks or Muke's decision, you can see the confidence intervals. First, that it's an animal, so 96% sure that that's an animal, and then it lists its top 5 predictions, the first being black swan. Great. But if I said this was a quoll, we would get a mismatch. And the box would be highlighted orange. You'd have 3 options. First, do you want to change your decision? Maybe you're swayed by Sticky Beaks' help. Or you can stick with your decision. Maybe you've seen the previous photo and you know that that tail of the animal is a wallaby. Or you can ask an expert, in which case it flags that photo, puts it into a really long list for someone like me to go look at. So be patient. So technically, I come in as an expert or a volunteer, and I add my third person's decision, and that's the final species. Oh, I'm running out of time. Quickly, off the back of our Camera Trap Chronicles event in Launceston last year, I was introduced to Andrew Campbell, who had this quoll living under his house, and he introduced me to his daughter Charlotte on the bottom right, who happened to be studying animation at Western Australian's TAFE. And so we got together, and I wanted to show you the great work that they put together for us as a bit of encouragement to sign up yourselves. Okay. Thank you. And that was all through volunteer work as well. So amazing. I'll pass over to Toby, I guess, who is diving into the Wild Tracker data. And yeah, we'll provide a good summary on that.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Toby Patterson, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of Lutruwita, Tasmania, land, sea and waterways, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm currently studying my Master of Protected Area Conservation at UTAS. Oh, do we really need that? I was quite happy doing it in the dark. And I'm working on my research thesis with Vanessa Adams as my supervisor, and in collaboration with Kath and Glenn from TLC. And my thesis is looking at the accuracy and value of citizen science gathered wild tracker data for Tasmanian conservation planning. So you've heard in the last two presentations a bit about wild tracker and how it works and what's driving it. But so just to recap briefly, obviously it's a citizen science tool that really relies on the participants not only putting out the trail cameras on their property and uploading images, but also there's a great value in them the images then being tagged. And so this creates a record to track what species have been found on individual properties, but could also become part of a wider resource to support biodiversity research and conservation planning around Tasmania. Before inclusion in official records, such as the Natural Values Atlas, though, there needs to be confidence that the tagged records are accurate and reliable. So to test this, TLC first engaged the assistance of a group of expert-level volunteers to correctly identify the species in a selection of images from over 400 of the wild tracker surveys. My research then analysed the accuracy of both the wild tracker participants or the users and Sticky Beak AI in tagging the 24 mammal species that had been identified by the experts from 28,000 of the images within wild tracker. So the method that I used to test the accuracy was the Cohen's-Kappa statistical index, which tests the level of agreement between two groups, also accounts for the level of disagreement and for chance. The index gives a rating between 0 for no agreement to 1 for full agreement or perfect agreement, with a good result being around 0.6, which represents substantial agreement or above, and is represented by the dotted line on my graphs. So, and the great news is that in that sample data set, the wild tracker participants had a terrific level of agreement with the experts, as you can see here. TLC were also interested in looking at the 4 threatened species mammals in the data set. So that's the Tasmanian devil, the eastern and spotted-tailed quolls, and the eastern barred bandicoot, plus the southern brown bandicoot, as it was suspected that the two bandicoots might be confused with each other. And you can see from the dotted highlights there that all 5 of the species of interest fell into the near perfect agreement range. Sticky Beak AI's level of agreement with the experts was also really positive, as you can see here against the dotted line. And there was near perfect to substantial agreement for 4 of the 5 species of interest, with only that southern brown bandicoot sitting lower in the moderate agreement range. And the literature says that the larger and more distinctive the species, probably quite logically, the more likely the accuracy of identification, which probably accounts for the southern brown bandicoot's lower rating given its small size and lack of distinctive markings. And conversely, why both the participants and Sticky Beak performed well for the 4 threatened species due to their more unique shapes and markings. So some other examples to build on the ones that Barry showed just before. One of the unique attributes of Wild Tracker as a citizen science project or program is that its participants know their properties intimately, They spend time observing their environment, often for many years, and see the birds and animals daily in many different types of conditions. And this knowledge is really an advantage in achieving accuracy in tagging, even when images captured might not be perfectly clear, as you can see from some of these examples, where there have been various levels of disagreement. There's a prize for anyone who can work out what the one in the top right is. I think, Kath, we might need to find something. Humans also have an advantage in being able to look back at recent images to see if there are clearer examples, and being able to understand the context of images and scale of the animals in them, and perhaps remember regular visitors. So the information that Barry's just provided about where his program's going sounds really positive for this in the future, for the next iteration of Wild Tracker. Sticky Beak plays an essential role in significantly filtering down the number of images that need to be reviewed and tagged, and in providing reliable options as a guide when needed. So if it's accepted that the Wild Tracker participants' level of accuracy is very high, my next step was to look at what opportunities that might create if the results were extrapolated across all the Wild Tracker observations and compared with other data. So just zooming into the area sort of southwest of Hobart that everyone's probably familiar with, this is the record of those 5 species of interest from the Natural Values Atlas for the last 5 years. And then these are the Wild Tracker records in red. And you can see that there's very little overlap between the data sets, and therefore that the Wild Tracker records would provide new information on species location if they were incorporated into the NVA. And looking at the Wild Tracker observations against the reserve estate, which I've got shown there in the grey hatch, also starts to identify future opportunities to support habitat connectivity. So the literature talks about the value of citizen science, including its capacity to gather significant amounts of data across broad areas, including on private land, for which there are less records. It notes that the primary motivation for citizen scientists is to contribute to science, and that the more often they participate, the more accurate their observations. Ongoing citizen science activity may also encourage participants to increase their level of concern for and activity in conservation actions. And so this research has shown that the Wild Tracker citizen science tags have a very high level of accuracy. They're in locations that provide new information, expanding the records on private land and away from towns, roads, and existing reserves, where much data is collected. And if accepted into the NVA, the Wild Tracker citizen scientists would have confidence that the sightings they've made on their properties are accurate, and that their participation in Wild Tracker is directly contributing towards expanding the body of scientific evidence on species location throughout Tasmania. So with all this knowledge, they may be encouraged to further contribute to conservation actions to protect Tasmania's biodiversity. So I'd just like to extend my thanks to Vanessa, Kath and Glenn for supporting me to work on this project with them. And a huge thanks to any of the volunteer experts who might be here today, who helped work through that large body of data to provide the validated images. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Toby, Glenn and Barry. It was a really nice round out of the Wild Tracker program. And I think Toby's exploration of the value of the records and the importance of us getting it into NVA, and that allows us to get into that stepping stone of working forward and focusing on that in the next 6 months, including that upgrade of incorporating Barry's new model in there, which will improve it as well. We're now going to swing across to 2 of our other conservation landholder programs, and starting with Millicent Beggs from the University of Tasmania, and she'll be looking at our Gardens for Wildlife program and the participants within it.
Thank you. Hello, yes, I'm Millicent. I'm an honours student at UTAS working with Professor Jason Byrne doing a project on the TLC's Gardens for Wildlife program. Firstly, before I begin, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Mwinina people. I acknowledge and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and all, yes. Okay. So, what is currently in the toolkit for urban conservation? It's all of these things like policies, green wedges, public gardening and nature reserves. And while all of these strategies have their place and their usefulness, they mostly focus on industry and publicly owned land. But between 50% and 80% of urban land cover is privately owned, and up to 36% of urban cover is gardens. An approach to engage these citizens is going to be necessary for us to make long-term change in conservation. So, what are wildlife gardening programs and what are wildlife-friendly behaviours themselves? So, wildlife gardening programs are community-based environmental education for private landholders. They provide members with information, education, with the expectation that they then go on to undertake natural planting. And these are normally adopted by informed and enthusiastic individuals. These wildlife gardening programs are run by community initiatives, educational institutions, and government bodies and national federations. Their delivery methods differ significantly, though, across the world. And wildlife-friendly behaviours, or near-natured gardening as it's sometimes called, is about providing a range of ecological resources for plants and animal species while avoiding environmentally aggressive practices, so pesticide usage, and is considered pro-environmental behaviour. So through the literature review that I conducted, I found that these programs fall sort of broadly into two categories. These categories being citizen science and community education, with citizen science programs' primary goals being about generating data, engaging the public in the scientific process, and raising awareness about conservation goals. So very much Wild Tracker. And these programs don't commonly run for extended periods of time. Normally they have a set end date, where the community education program's primary goals are about engaging individuals in wildlife-friendly behaviours, encouraging environmental consciousness, and educating and informing while raising awareness about best practices. And this involves a sort of broader social interaction and relationship building. And these programs don't normally have a set end date. So where in the world are these programs occurring? I found that these programs were pretty common in the developed countries, with long-running programs in the USA and France, and initiatives in Africa and Latin America were more commonly focused on agricultural concerns over those of conservation. In Australia, there are community education programs in all 6 states and 1 territory, with only the ACT being unrepresented. They are administered by private community groups, NGOs, local councils, and because a large number of these programs are run by individual local councils instead of a state or a national level, there's large areas which are actually unrepresented. So, for example, the Sunshine Coast has a Gardens for Wildlife program, but Brisbane doesn't. So, across Australia, I found 37 programs currently running, with Victoria having the largest number at 25, and the majority of the Victorian programs began after a body of research was conducted by Professor Laura Mumwa on an original program, the Knox Gardens for Wildlife, where with this research was then transferred into a framework for scaling out to other LGAs. Queensland and New South Wales ended up having 4 programs, and all of the other assessed areas just had 1. Victoria, the majority of these programs ended up being run by councils, with everywhere else sort of ended up being run by mostly NGOs, and then 1 program was run by state government in South Australia. Tasmania and Queensland were the only two programs that actually costed anything. So there were two programs in Queensland that cost $33 and $35, and the TLC's program cost $30. These programs utilized lots of different features to get their messages out. So the numbers here are the number of programs which had those things. So signs, discounts, free plants. 22 programs had site visits, 20 of which were in Victoria, which seems to have then spun from the Knox program, starting with site visits and finding those to be very effective. They also had things like websites and newsletters and social media groups and events. But what were the behaviors these programs were? Ooh, really went fast. So the most common behaviors being promoted were growing native plants, installing water features, removing environmental weeds, mulching, pet control, and tree planting along with tree maintenance. And these behaviors were all outlined in this key, which is the A to H of the recipe to success, which was also in the Knox Gardens for Wildlife program and ended up being proliferated out to 12 other programs appearing in their booklets, much the same as this. Some uncommon but very interesting recommendations were safe tree netting, nature play, erosion control, cane toad trapping, copper log installation, and making organic fertilizer. The erosion control, cane toad trapping, and copper log installation were recommended only by the Your Back Garden in the Redlands, which their program very specifically focuses on wetland restoration and offers members in areas of really high importance up to $750 to participate in re-establishing those environments into their areas, which I thought was a very interesting thing. So what are the primary concerns of these programs? Almost all of these programs were concerned with supporting local animals with food, water, and shelter, and protection and enhancement of biodiversity, with a few of the programs then being concerned with improving connectivity to combat the fragmentation caused by urbanization. And few of these programs had very specific and localized concerns. So these specific localized concerns were abating bushfire risk, combating climate change. 3 of the programs specifically highlighted improving health and well-being of the residents in their programs. And some of them wanted to tackle the urban heat island effect. But some of these programs had incredibly specific things that they were looking to tackle. So one such program was the Cardinia Gardens for Wildlife, which was working to conserve the southern brown-eared bandicoot, and then also the wetland restoration for the Redlands. Yeah. So for me now, going on to do my survey on the Gardens for Wildlife members, now that we know what these programs are offering and what behaviours they're trying to promote and what concerns they're aiming to address, I'm using this information to design my survey and the interview questions that I'm taking out to the Gardens for Wildlife members. With my survey, I'm aiming to find what changes, if any, Gardens for Wildlife members have made since joining the program. What role do their values play in species conservation? How effective do the gardeners believe they are in achieving the Gardens for Wildlife program's objectives? And how has participation in wildlife gardening affected their self-perceived health and well-being benefits? Yeah. So if you are a Gardens for Wildlife member and anything I've talked to you today about has interested you, I would really appreciate it if you'd be willing to do the survey. Yeah, please scan the QR code. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Millicent. That was a great summary of the different programs around Australia and a really great plug. So I second that. If anyone else is out there and wants to do the survey, we'd really appreciate it. Our next speaker will be Laura Smith, also from UTAS, and she'll be talking about our Land for Wildlife program. So it's a good follow-on.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today. So I'm going to be sharing with you a very quick overview of my recent master's project, which I've called Conservation Advice in the Land for Wildlife program. So for those of you who don't know, Land for Wildlife is a free and non-binding private land conservation scheme for freehold properties. And it's been administered by the TLC since about 2019 when it was taken over from the state government. So one of the aims of the program is to provide conservation land management advice and support to members to assist them in conservation activities on their own properties. So people sign their property up to the program and become a member of the Land for Wildlife community. And then when people sign up, a Land for Wildlife assessor, which is often a volunteer, will visit the new property and conduct an ecological site assessment, which they then use to produce a property report. And the property report contains an overview of the natural values and threats on the property, and then also gives some tailored personalised land management advice and general conservation tips. So the purpose of my research was to review how advice is currently given within the Land for Wildlife program and to investigate members' motivations and their perceptions of the advice that they've received through the program. And then also to provide some practical recommendations for improvements that could be made, considering the resource constraints of the program within a fully philanthropically funded organisation. So to do this, I reviewed a lot of previously issued property reports, and I also surveyed Land for Wildlife members. I'm not going to go too much into the specifics of the advice in this presentation because there's quite a lot of results, but I've made this word cloud that sort of illustrates the relative frequency of different types of advice that's given. And as you can see, weed control is the most popular topic, but there's also a lot of other more niche things as well. On to some results. Why do landholders join Land for Wildlife? So overwhelmingly, I found that it was out of a desire to protect wildlife and to conserve habitat, but people also joined to learn and receive advice and information from the program, to be part of a like-minded community. And there's also quite a big neighbourhood influence aspect to it. So people see other people's Land for Wildlife signs and they feel inspired to find out what that program is and to join it themselves. Some people have purchased properties that are already registered and they want to continue the registration. And something I thought was interesting, one person said they want specifically to signal their values outwards. So they want to promote the program so that other people in their community will understand that they have conservation values and they intend to manage their land with that in mind. And what are members' aims for their properties? Once again, overwhelmingly, it's to do conservation. And within that, many people want to do kind of active conservation activities, sort of restoration. And some want to just leave their properties undisturbed as kind of like refuges for wildlife and not do active management. Some people have very specific aims like weed management, or they want to learn about native species and just to share their space with wildlife. Here's some results from the Land for Wildlife member survey. So going from the top, most people said they have a good understanding of the values and threats present on their properties, and they also have clear land management aims and objectives for managing their properties. 79% of people said that they have similar ideas to Land for Wildlife about how best to manage their land, while a few people were a bit neutral about that. 2/3 of people said they felt satisfied with the support they've received through the program and that they've received useful and actionable advice. But only 40% of people agreed that their current land management practices are actually based on advice that they've received from Land for Wildlife. Whereas, 40% were neutral about that as well, and 20% disagreed. So those last three don't sound super positive, but one big thing I will say is that many of the survey respondents had joined the program prior to 2019 when TLC took over management. And so before that time, they hadn't received property reports, and they probably had not received, I guess, advice from the program at all. So there's some things to pick apart within that about what it means for the TLC managing this program. We also asked people what the most helpful resources they received were, and there was very clear preference for this kind of personalised and property-specific advice. Really liked the property report, the verbal advice on the day of the assessment, and then a personalised property species list. And some free text responses also indicated that people would like to see more workshops and events for learning, and there was some things like using apps and camera traps. And they would also like advice on much more complex issues like feral cat control, ecological burning, and climate change adaptation. So my project outcomes, I would say we have a better understanding of members' aims, their motivations, and their support needs. And we also have confirmation that those the property assessment and the report are very highly regarded by those members who have received them, and that they are really crucial opportunities for communication between the program and members, and yeah, that opportunity to give and receive advice. I've worked with the Land for Wildlife staff to revise the property report template, and we've streamlined it and made it a lot easier for the assessors to use, hopefully be faster to produce reports and have them be more consistent. And there's also an increased focus on articulating the landholders' aims, and then really giving advice that that is what those people want to receive. And we also revised the conservation tips pages, which is what you can see here on the right of the screen, and focus on using kind of like positive language to balance negative ideas like threats and hard work, yeah, focus on like simple and actionable things that people can do regardless of their physical capacity and things like that, to account for the very diverse Land for Wildlife membership. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Laura. Again, another great summary of the programs and some of the places where it's doing some really fantastic work. We're moving on to Nicole Sheriff, who is our Conservation Programs Manager here at TLC, and she'll be talking to you about some of the other private land conservation programs we've got going on.
Great. Thanks, Kath. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the Palawa people and respect their care of Lutruwita in the past, present and future. It's quite important in all the work that we do here at Tasland Conservancy. So yeah, this first slide, I think, is a great introduction for what I'm going to talk to you about today. It's really about private land protection through a particular program, our revolving fund program. It's great for many reasons. The first reason being it's got a great photo of Matilda Terry, who's our conservation ecologist gun, and she's helped me prepare this presentation, and she's also instrumental behind everything we do in the revolving fund. Also, with this image, hopefully you can all, many of you should be able to recognise the Freycinet National Park in the background. It's obviously an icon for Tassie in terms of conservation and protection. But I think what often gets missed when we look across a landscape like this is all the I guess all the private land conservation that goes on. So in this context, you're actually looking out across a Ramsar listed wetland in Malting Lagoon. There's TLC reserves with Big Punch Bowl and Long Point. And then for many of the private landholders in the room, there's conservation covenants and many land for wildlife properties in this landscape. And the big thing for me is it's actually the visual reality of active conservation that's interspersed in a landscape with agriculture, tourism, and people. We're definitely part of it. And so it's been great following Millicent, well, following Glenn and Barry and Millicent and
Laura. They're basically talking about the programs that I'm working in at TLC. So we're working in all the programs that are not associated with TLC reserves. So many of you here and online will be part of these through Land for Wildlife, Gardens for Wildlife, and Midlands Conservation Partnership landholders, TLC supporters, bequesters and partners. You all add to what we're doing in the private land context. And so given your interest, I'm going to talk today about how we prioritise within the revolving fund program. And that's basically where we purchase land, we place a covenant over it for the protection of that land in perpetuity. And if you look at the map, those little dots, they're actually 60 properties that have been purchased and protected and sold by TLC through the revolving fund program. It amounts to about 7,000 hectares, which in terms of context, if you can visualise the local government area of Hobart, so broadly, that's the equivalent land area that has been protected by private landholders now. So as I mentioned, the revolving fund is about people, but primarily it's also about the protection of biodiversity benefits. We buy and sell land with the intent of covering our costs to ensure that we can continue to buy and sell land and protect it into the future. So our intent in the revolving fund program is simply to cover costs and then reinvest that funding back into conservation on private land. To place conservation covenants on a property title, we work very closely with the Department of Natural Resources and Environment, particularly the Private Land Conservation Program. And if you have a look at this image, it's actually a picture of a property that's currently for sale, if anyone's interested in Bruny Island land. It's at Apollo Bay, and it's 60 hectares, which in that landscape, 60 hectares protected and not fragmented by subdivision is so significant. The wee parcel up in the top is actually what we call an exclusion zone. And the purpose of that is to ensure that people are integrated into the conservation covenants. That area is basically open to be built on and for people to make their home while protecting the rest of the land for the flora and fauna. And so in terms of prioritising what land we purchase across the state, funding from the Commonwealth was provided in about 2007 with the purpose to increase private land component of forest communities reserved across Tasmania. The funding we received aligns with the 9 bioregions across the state, which is the colourful image on the left. And there are key revolving fund criteria that we need to meet when we're assessing land for its suitability to purchase and conserve. These criteria include size. It must be over 12 hectares of mostly native habitat, old growth forests, under-reserved forest communities in each of these bioregions, and threatened forest communities threatened Tasmanian forest communities and Commonwealth threatened vegetation communities as well. And I've popped that little image up on the right, and if you look at the little pink dot, basically that's another property up for sale, but that's our Colebrook revolving fund property, and you can see the connectivity. It's adjacent to a Parks and Wildlife Reserve, which then flows into the TLC Flat Rock Reserve, into the Chauncey Vale Reserve, and onto another conservation covenant. So just, I guess, highlighting the connectivity, which is super important. And just been given the time nod for Miss Eve, but in terms of how we prioritise the purchase of land, the science team have a conservation planning system, which is that small image on the bottom right, and you can see this property at Seaford Road, which was a revolving fund property we sold last year, has really high conservation significance from that dark green. But with the revolving fund, we actually need to be able to delve into the detail of those priorities in greater detail. And Anne Boothroyd from UTAS has worked very closely with us and pulled together a myriad of information to develop the revolving fund prioritisation tool, which is the larger image. And basically, you can see it's a hotspot. It's red. It meets a number of the revolving fund criteria, EPBC listed vegetation communities, old growth. There's so much that can be layered into it, which through Anne's expertise, we've been able to consolidate into one little quick tool. And this just goes into it in a little bit more detail to show you that it's got the EPBC listed salt marsh there. It's got FCF priority vegetation, statewide listed vegetation communities. So being able to do a desktop assessment before we go into the field has really made the work we do and the investigations way more efficient. And part of the value of the tool as well, and I must acknowledge, is Sean Thurston's has been able to roll it out to a web-based tool useful across the business. We can bring in information from external sources such as ListMap and the Natural Values Atlas and overlay it all. But just to conclude, I guess I wanted to reiterate, you get to learn a lot from people who've trodden the path before you. And I'm sure many of you know Lee Walters. He's reputedly Australia's least friendly real estate agent. But I know Lee has left with both myself and Tilly and others working in this space that it's not about the sale of the land. It's about the right person to be the custodian into the future. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Nicole. That's a great example of how the tools that we have developed are helping our team make better decisions across our landscape. I'm now going to pass over to Professor Vanessa Adams, who is a board member as well as our incoming chair of the TLC Science Council. And she's going to be talking to us on the Midlands Conservation Project and the lessons learned from that restoration. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. So I'll take us to the Midlands and the last of our off-reserve programs in TLC. And I'll talk about the Midlands Conservation Partnership, but also the range of complementary approaches in the Midlands that we need. I start with this image because I know that some people have quite a conflicted relationship with production landscapes. Some people feel that there's signs of decline. I think this is an image of hope. It has an old growth tree that obviously is unwell. But below it are actually almost 400 babies coming through in about 10 hectares that we've counted. So where we look after nature, there's huge regenerative potential, and our job is to enable that repair. So I call Tasmania the curious case of Tasmania because it's a place that's nearly 50% protected and conserved, and yet we have regions of extraordinary loss and degradation, like the Midlands, so those hashed bioregions. And the entire state is moderate to high priority when we use prioritization tools for plants. So all of it's important, lots of it's already protected, much of it's degraded. We actually have a great deal of work to do, and that lies outside our reserve system. And so our job is really to think about what do we need to know to design, evaluate, and refine a whole range of programs that enable people to look after their own land in ways that are meaningful and often are very small and incremental ways that we relate to and manage our nature to ultimately improve it and our businesses and lives. So how do we design a program and how do we evaluate it? Through a basic understanding of why we use a range of tools. And so this is a messy causal diagram around our beliefs of why we might put a piece of property into a stewardship program like the Midlands Conservation Program versus a covenant to lock it up and keep it away. And that's about the type of vegetation we are targeting and what it actually needs. Does it thrive under disturbance regimes, or does it need to be in a lower disturbance regime? So what might benefit it? And then we need to think about what places look and feel like that in the landscape so we can properly say what difference are we making. We chose to do that with two data products, a woody cover product and a habitat condition product. And I want you to focus on the green and yellow blurbs. And the bottom is the Midlands Conservation Program, where you want to look for the peak being above average, and that's the Covenant Program. And the basic take home is that you can't quite see the lovely yellow grasslands just below the green. But the Midlands Conservation Program actually has, after 10 years of management on 15 active properties, thinking about the right ways to graze their properties, to look after these grasslands, are trending in the positive direction, which I personally think is phenomenal for just 10 years of management with a satellite remote sensed model of conditions. So that's actually an amazing result given the type of data we're working with. And covenants are not showing that same trend for grassy ecosystems, but they are quite a significant positive pulse in woody cover. So locking things up benefits woody cover. Disturbance regimes that are really fine-tuned to those grasslands works for grassland ecosystems. But we did see actually some trending of the woody cover in our MCP, which some people might want. They might want forest to be coming back. Some people might feel really positive about that. If you want a grassland to stay a grassland, you might not want that woody cover coming in. So the question becomes, can we use fine scale plot data that has been an investment from the MCP and the ecologist, Matt Appleby, and the coordinator, Pierre Deforny? Can we use that data and that huge investment in understanding what's going on in those properties to explain site level variance? And the answer is yes. Everyone's overseas, so they didn't actually know I got to steal their data. So this is what happens when you go on long holidays to Europe, Pierre and Natasha and Matt. But this is their early results, which really excite me. And essentially, I want you to look at these dots that are way above the rest. And this is exactly what we would expect. Themata, as one of our species of grass that we're looking after in these grasslands, happens to love good rain in winter and spring, and it therefore needs to be rested after those rains in winter and spring. And we've actually known this for quite a long time, so it's rather reassuring that the data explains a huge amount of site level variance and that it accords with all the things that people like Louise Gilfighter have been telling us for years and years, if only we would listen, which is largely that the reasons why we put these places into conservation is that we can change the way we manage them. We can change them based on best practice. We can put them into resting periods in lower intensity regimes, and the biodiversity thrives under those. So I guess the soul searching question for us is, why aren't we doing that more? So obviously it is working based on the data we have. We could do more of it. And potentially it's a great opportunity to revise a bit of our monitoring and a bit of our management advice to those 15 amazing landholders already looking after a huge amount of that grassland. And lastly, this is work that Pierre led. Covenants help lock up land and protect woody cover that needs to be not disturbed. Stewardship looks after grasslands that love a bit of disturbance, but what about the rest? There are areas in decline. How do we either find them and help them regenerate or start to replant where they're too far gone? And so this was a prioritization that he led, thinking about how do we balance the needs of the landscape for biodiversity and production, knowing that often we want to get those plants back in that system. And he led a participatory planning process with an MCDA process approach. And what's, I guess, main thing is that I've zoomed into a little area so you can see the true differences. But when we go for pure feasibility, we may not prioritize areas that are of high priority for just conservation. And when we work with landholders, we can find areas that are still important under both, that are good for business and good for people. And we can start to put plantings in that complement those other programs. Oh, jeepers. All right, so ultimately, I call it the Friends of the Midlands Conservation Partnership because I love a good stewardship program. I feel really positive about finding things that work, but covenants are important too. Locking it up is great. So too is replanting and trying to get that diversity back in the system to create a resilient ecosystem. And so what this, I suppose, body of work shows, led by amazing people like Natasha and Pierre, is that stewardship is working. Lands that need disturbance are best held by those that can look after them in the right way. Locking it up works, again, in the right ecosystems, and putting things back in can be strategic, and tools help us to identify those places in the landscape. So really, thanks to all my friends enjoying their lovely holidays in South Africa and Europe. That's what you get when you leave. You get your work presented on your behalf, but thank you also to the Midlands Conservation Partnership properties doing all those amazing things for those beautiful grasslands.
Thanks, Vanessa. It was fantastic to hear all those early results. I'd like to now bring all of the speakers up from the final session. for the last of our Q&As. Do we have any questions around the room? Are we all, Craig?
Thanks, Barry. My question's for you. Your fabulous mucus system, does it work with video and does it work with thermal imaging?
It can work with thermal imaging if it's been trained on those data. So there's not much of it around, unfortunately, so it wouldn't natively adapt to it. It works completely fine on color night images or infrared night images, so it can distinguish quite different types of imagery. So with the right training data, it would work perfectly well. In fact, it would also work with audiograms as well. So that was talked about earlier. It can be very easily trained to use those sort of data as well. And what was the other thing you asked? Video. Yeah, you can use video. You've just got to snapshot the frame. So you might take one frame every second, for example, out of the 30, and then it's quite happy to classify those too.
I've got a question from online for Toby/Glenn. Are the wild tracker records going to be considered for inclusion in the iNaturalist or NVA or Atlas Living Australia? What is the barrier to this occurring if it's not happening?
Yeah, the goal is to get it into the NVA, and the records in there are also shared with the Atlas Living Australia. There's some technical work in being able to export the data and get it into the right formats for the NVA. And my understanding is that the NVA itself has also been overhauled in that regard. So we're being a little bit patient with that. But also, I guess Toby's work goes a long way towards building the case that these records can be very accurate and very informative. And so I guess we're also building on previous cases like iNaturalist, who have done a lot of work in showing the value of those records, citizen science generally. Yes, but that's the grand plan.
I've got a question for Barry around, so AI obviously is being applied globally as well, and no doubt this is leading work, but how are you seeing AI being used? Is it being used in a similar way in ID forms across the world?
Yeah. So Megadetector is based on global data sets. That's the one that finds animals and images. And then a team related to Megadetector have developed a more general model called SpeciesNet, which includes over 1,000 different classifications. There's obviously a trade-off that the more species that you have in your model that are not in the location you're surveying, the more chance you've got of finding an anomaly in there. So there are ways to restrict those sorts of images too. Yeah, so there's global initiatives to develop these models. Something like MUC is useful in that I've got a Tasmanian model that I've trained for it, but it's not just built for a Tasmanian model. And in fact, I'm part of a program called WildObs, which is leveraging Australia's research infrastructure to unify all the camera trapping data sets Australia-wide and create a system where anyone will be able to train their own models locally or use an Australia-wide model trained by MUC and plugged into WildObs to then narrow their species list and use it for just their given location. So that momentum continues to build.
Just a question for Glenn, and it's on Wild Tracker. One of the fantastic things about Wild Tracker is repeat monitoring. Otherwise, it's just a survey, but repeated camera trapping at set points on your property can give you that scientific information about declines or increases or species richness. So I think yours and the lady that talked, Toby, it's really good to see the Wild Tracker program contributing to the research side of where species are and whether they're increasing or decreasing. Do both of you have a comment on the usefulness of that aspect?
Yeah, I guess we're still in the early phases. It's Wild Tracker has been a thing for 5 years now, and I forgot to mention that it's evolved so much that I'm still considering all of those initial droppers and nibblers as potential people who are hooked. And it is another ultimate goal is to get those repeat surveys up. And so we were thinking about other examples like BirdLife Australia's backyard bird count, where you have a discrete month of action and we get everyone who has a camera trap to put them out at the same time. And we do it at the same time every year. So we're working towards that. But currently we're still at that point of just getting whatever records we can into whatever databases we can. And it's been I think it's been a really good learning process on how people use systems before we move into that next phase.
Maybe the other thing to add is the process that you went through with the experts to validate the data that I'm working with. I think that has been a really valuable process that can be used in the future, potentially for other research purposes, as a tool in different settings.
The great thing is that we have the photos to refer back to whenever we want. So the difference with like bird observations and things is you're relying on the accuracy of that person at the time, whereas we can always backtrack and rerun these photos through Barry's next iteration and get more and more accurate.
Sorry, my question's for Glenn as well and that group. How do you propose to manage the data going forward in time? And also where there's an absence of data, if you're going to load onto the MVA, be very cautious where there's an absence of data. Might not mean that those values aren't there. They just haven't been recorded, and how that data gets used then is quite important. So 2 questions there, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, I agree on the importance of zeros as well. That's been a real challenge and continues to be a challenge with landholders in uploading surveys that don't have devils in them, because they're important too. So even if you are just getting repeated paddy melons, that's important data for us to include in these data sets. But I guess one of the principles of citizen science is to share as much as you can, whether that's the data or what you've learned from collecting it. And so we're very open to that. I would say we're still at a phase where we're learning how to work with the data and extract it and share it in the first instance. But once we get to that point, yeah, I think NVA is used by everybody. So that's our sort of first point.
So do you see that you'll sunset some of the data after, say, 10 years or something? Is it still relevant? I guess these are the big questions.
Yeah, I'll let someone else decide on that.
as a first cut, but so that it can be retrieved as needed. But that's certainly something that we're really aware of, because not even just with Wild Tracker, but also with all of the reserves data set, whether that be audio, which we don't actually have that much of, but surprisingly we have a lot of terabytes, and all of our camera images, and when that all goes into cold storage, and I'm sure it's always get that out. So it's something that we're considering, and it's also something with all the AWS and what we deal with our credits there too. So if you know the answer, open. Okay, I'm getting some, I think we've had a really great session, and I might wind up, and so thank these the speakers here. And then I would like to introduce, I'll let you guys sit down. So I'm going to hand over to Professor Ted Lefroy, who is actually our outgoing chair of the TLC Science Council and is on our board. And Ted has been on the Science Council for about 14 years and has been the chair for the last 5. And certainly I would like to, really heartfeltly thank him for his support over that years, whether that's with the science team, but actually wider across the organisation. I can't tell you how often a pertinent, timely TED question comes in and the science team think, well, that, but it's those questions that get us thinking and thinking about why we're doing it and how we're doing it. Ted's also been amazing with us out in the field, and your limericks have been on point at all time, creative and to the point. So with that, I would like to thank Ted, but also introduce Ted to close the symposium.
Thanks, Kath. You may have noticed a certain symmetry in the proceedings today, starting with Sally Bryant, who I'm pretty sure was the first ecologist that TLC employed, and ending with Vanessa Adams, who's the incoming chair of our Science Council. And just reflecting on the 10 years I've been on the board and associated with TLC, there's a real story between those two bookends about the growth of the organisation, not just physically, but growth in its impact, in its expansion into different forms of conservation and influence. And there's a data set that the board sees every meeting that appears in the papers, updated every 2 months, which is all about that influence, and it's an attempt to capture it physically in hectares. It's called the conservation footprint. And essentially it tells you about TLC's impact over 3 different broad classes of land. So if you imagine a pie diagram, land that TLC has bought, covenanted and manages as reserves makes up 25% of that pie diagram and has one owner. Land that TLC has covenanted and either by sale or gift has passed on to someone else to manage through the revolving fund that you heard Nicole talk about, or land that TLC has covenanted on behalf of existing landholders makes up 35%. With, at last count, 664 landholders. And the largest category is land that TLC never intends to own. It's owned by others, and it represents participants in conservation programs like the Midlands Conservation Partnership that Vanessa talked about, and Land for Wildlife. And it is where information networks and stewardship payments are used to encourage conservation. That takes up 40% of that figure and represents 900 landholders. If you add to that Wild Tracker and Gardens for Wildlife, where we don't actually count hectares, you've got 1,700 landholders in that last category. Now, there's 2 observations about that. One is TLC's influence becomes more diffuse as you move away from having title over land to covenants to just persuasion and encouragement. And the other thing is that I think it illustrates the enormous potential that TLC has in influencing conservation beyond its reserves. But there is a catch, and it's something that the board has confronted regularly. It's far more difficult to find financial support for off-reserve conservation programs. Understandably, people see title as protection, and you've got the guarantee or the security of title. And I think what was exciting about today, we've seen the first inkling of some evidence that is that provides support that those programs that operate under persuasion and information networks are having a positive influence on not just human behaviour, conservation behaviour, but on the species and communities of interest. Now, I want to get back to that in a minute, but I want to correct the misapprehension. If you think that reserves only making up 25% of that figure, that conservation footprint, says something about their importance. They are central to TLC. And in fact, it's written in the Constitution that TLC's purpose is to acquire and manage land for conservation. Not only that, the reason we have a science team is because of the reserves, because of 3 questions that the board has put to the team. Where do we invest the money so generously donated by our supporters to best protect nature? What's happening on those reserves? And where there is trends, why? The where question is a static snapshot, but it's vitally important because behind it is the biggest decision that the organisation makes to purchase land. And at previous science symposium, you would have heard about this beast called the Conservation Prioritisation Tool that started 15 years ago as a world-class reserve system. And a huge amount of effort was put into this to make sure that there was a systematic process of identifying where is the next parcel of land that can best protect those species underrepresented in the public reserve estate and on our properties. And the reason we only heard a brief mention today when Nicole talked about its application to the revolving fund is it's become normalised. It's part of everyday practice. It's working, the staff are using it. It was launched into the world in May this year at an international conference and is now freely available for other like-minded organisations to use. That idea of where do we invest is a snapshot in time. If you like, it's nature as a noun. The question of what's happening is nature as a verb. It's about the dynamics, it's about trends, and equally the science team has put in a huge effort over the last 5 years to develop a surveillance monitoring program capable of detecting change against seasonal variation and environmental noise, because it's vitally important that we have confidence if we're seeing trends in eastern quolls or in cider gums or in different communities and species, that we know these trends are real. And we only heard a brief mention of the idea of monitoring, I think with Alice Robbins, some very exciting work on using drones, and maybe that will contribute to the surveillance monitoring. The third question that comes up is why are these things changing? And this is, whereas the where question is a noun and the what question is a verb, this is a whole sentence that links pattern to process. When patterns become apparent, we then want to know what's the underlying process. And that is where we have to work in numbers, and why TLC has 13 research partners and 19 postgraduate students, from summer interns up to PhDs. And it's really why the symposium came about, was to acknowledge all of those partners, without which we can't answer the why questions, because they require landscape manipulation to be able to understand connection between pattern and process. Now, I said I'd get back to that question about the off-reserve programs. Now, some of you, I suspect, might read the Australian Financial Review, in which case you'd be familiar with philanthropy, the Philanthropy Top 50. It's a list that comes out every year in the Financial Review. It lists Australia's top philanthropists. It's put together by a man called John McLeod, who works for JB Weir, the investment manager. And we've had the benefit of some of his advice over the years. And he's studied the philanthropic sector for over 20 years. And he's recognised 2 trends. One is a change from many small investors to few larger investors. And the other is investors are becoming far more discerning. He calls them impact investors. So before people invest in environmental conservation, they want to see evidence that there's going to be an impact. And this is where I come to the last presentation. Even though Vanessa didn't mention it, that's the first time that we have seen published data from a research project on one of our conservation programs that shows a positive impact between a stewardship program and not only human behaviour, but the target species. So without owning land, we can have an impact. It's that sort of data that's going to make a difference to supporting that sort of work. And listening to Barry and Glenn and Toby, maybe in a few years' time, we'll be seeing how Wild Tracker is being used, for instance, to demonstrate that land for wildlife is having a measurable impact on forgotten the name of the bandicoot, eastern barred bandicoots, and other threatened species which are cropping up on cameras in places where people didn't expect them. But there was a very pertinent question: how do we turn an observational tool and a persuasive tool into a scientific one? And I'd be confident that we can see that appearing. I do know if you come next year, you'll hear about a project that Vanessa and her students are working on that is looking at land for wildlife in detail and trying to measure the effectiveness of that program on human behaviour, and one day maybe even species and communities. Time will tell. Okay, that's my time. I now have two duties. One is to invite you to the Devil's Brewery over the road, the pub directly across, so that we can all meet with the speakers. And I want to thank the terrific TLC staff. Everybody in the organisation who is in Hobart today has a job here, and it wouldn't happen without them. But most of all, I want to acknowledge Kath and the tremendous work she's done leading the science team in the last 4 years. It's the professionalism and the capacity of that team is really impressive, and going out in the field with them, seeing the work they do, I'm in awe of what they achieve, and they all deserve your thanks. Please join me in congratulating.